Oops, stop share. So let me introduce my colleagues. Also, there in the upper row. Caitlin Corkins is the Tax Credits and Grants Coordinator of the Vermont Agency of Commerce and Community Development. She's a native Vermonter from Bristol, holds a BA from Knox College, Museum Studies Certificate from Tufts, and an MS in Historic Preservation from UVM. She's managed Vermont's Federal Rehabilitation and Investment Tax Credit Program, the Downtown Village Center Tax Credit Program, and the Division for Historic Preservation and Barn Preservation Grant Programs for 10 years. I also want to introduce Alex Tolstoy, who is the field representative for the Preservation Trust of Vermont. Alex began his career as a carpenter and then went to UVM to earn his master's in historic preservation. He now splits his time between carpentry and community development. So we're your team for tonight, and we want to provide you with not nostalgia, but with as much practical information as we can to make the idea of preserving barns and sharing why that's important to people who really need practical advice. So my job now is to pose some questions and keep us moving forward. And I'll pose this one to my panel here. If in your behalf, if I own a barn and want to preserve it, what do I do first? What do I do second? What's the best sequencing? So.
Well, I'm happy to start. Phil, thanks so much for the introduction. It's really great to be here tonight. I think your first question is really appropriate because that is sort of the thing that people either when they buy a property or inherit a property, or maybe they've been owners for a while, but they've been looking at that barn and wondering, what do I do? How do I do it? Should I save it? How much is it going to cost? You know, there's a lot of maybe anxiety that comes with owning a historic barn. And I think the first advice I would give folks is to reach out and try and find out as much as you can from the experts around you, whether it's, you know, reaching out to the local historical society to find out more about the history of the property, understand what, you know, what you have, what its place in the community is, but then also reaching out to resources, whether it's, you know, the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation or the Preservation Trust of Vermont, to try and get some technical assistance to help you understand, again, what you have and how to go about preserving it.
Great. Just again, want to say thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure being here. But to follow up on what Caitlin was saying, you know, I think number one is you have to fall in love with the barn, right? You have to go in and crawl around and find, you know, the little odd quirks about this building and try to think about how it was used and, you know, what animals were kept there and, you know, what's the current state. Fall in love with the building. I don't think it will be hard to do once you do start crawling around. And then, yeah, as Caitlin said, you know, reach out to Preservation Trust or the division. If you haven't already fallen in love with the building, we'll come and we'll help you fall in love with the building. And once, you know, you have that connection to it and you understand the importance of the building to your property or to your community, then I think, you know, the other steps will kind of fall in line of, you know, thinking about what do you do with the building? What kind of work does it need? Who can I find to do the work? All that will kind of follow up. But number one, I would say, get inside of it and start investigating.
I'd add another bullet point there, and that is, as you're falling in love, to also assess your needs. I mean, are there what could you use the barn for? And that, of course, is a seasonal question too. And it may have something to do not just with what you want to use it for, but what your neighbors might. So in other words, there might be a neighborhood aspect to this too that's worth considering. You know, in the past, where people move barns around all the time, and we're always amazed in this day and age about what kind of technology, which isn't ours, it seems pretty basic, but nevertheless, they were undaunted by moving structures around. Does that still make sense to save a barn if it's at risk or can't stay where it is?
I'll jump on this one, Caleb. I think it all kind of depends on how you want to use the barn and how you want it to be interpreted, right? And that as historic preservationists, we look at historic buildings for their historic integrity. And when we think about historic integrity, we kind of go down a list of different aspects of historic significance. Location and setting are definitely part of the story of a building and help us interpret it, right? And so when we move buildings, our buildings have been moved in the past, it's part of their history. And that's something to definitely be considered before we go around moving barns, even though they have been likely moved in their past or could have been moved. But I think Caitlin might agree with me. Well, I'll say might agree with me. If it's between demolition or moving it, it's definitely a conversation that we'd love to have. And I think both Caitlin and I would love to be part of that conversation and try to find a solution that works for everybody.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Alex. I mean, I think when we're talking about moving historic buildings, that's not generally the first thing that we advocate for as historic preservationists, because the location of the building and its setting are important, as Alex mentioned, to sort of helping understand the history of the building. And particularly when you're talking about something like a barn, if it's out in the middle of the field and then it gets moved into the center of town, the context around it really changes a lot. But that's not to say that it should never happen. Obviously, barns did get moved a lot in the past. They were functional buildings. I think Lisa Papazian a couple of weeks ago described barns as being tools before being buildings, and I really like that. I mean, they served a very practical purpose, and so they needed to be moved to continue to serve their, for the farm as the farm evolved, farming practices evolved, that kind of thing. I mean, I will say that moving barns is probably more challenging now than it was historically. That might seem odd to say that, but I think there's just a lot more kind of in the way if you want to move a building now than if in the past. And I'm even thinking of things like power lines, and the cost associated with moving buildings is a lot more than it was historically. So those are some challenges that you want to think through really carefully. I mean, if you can buy the building for $1, but it costs you $500,000 to move it, it's still a really expensive project. So it's a great thing to have the conversation and think about all the options and sort of the pros and cons of, can we figure out a way to use the barn where it is now, or is really the best option to save it, to move it?
If Philip, if I could just kind of
Yeah,
add something,
go for
I
it.
think another kind of part of that is, what may seem like a daunting task today, like moving a barn. While it's difficult, I think it's important when you're falling in love with the barn and you're wandering around it and you're looking at what seems like really daunting issues with the barn, like foundations and things like that. It's important to keep in mind that there are people that raise barns, jack barns up and do serious repairs, serious surgery to these buildings all the time. So It's just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind that while you may think it seems impossible to do, it's something that is definitely possible.
If the barn owner is not actively engaged in agriculture, but wants to save their barn, what are 2 or 3 or however many good alternative uses for barns in today's world? And maybe what are less good alternative uses that might, at the end of the day, compromise what the building really is?
I'm happy to start that discussion. It's such an interesting question, because reusing historic buildings, and particularly barns, is something that has happened throughout time. And even if you look at a farm as it's evolved, barns are rarely built and then stay static. They're always having to be adapted as farming practices change. So that's part of the nature of the history of barns, is that this constant amount of change, and it makes for buildings that are often pretty flexible to serve new uses that might not be agricultural. So I think that's really an exciting thing. If somebody has a barn and it's not an active farm anymore, they don't have an agricultural purpose for it, it doesn't mean the building is useless. There's still a lot of possibilities. I think it's really hard to sort of pinpoint here like the top 3 ways to reuse your barn, because to me, one of the things that you have to ask first is, what is it about this particular building that's important and significant that I'd want to save, that I'd want to make sure doesn't have to be changed or compromised in order to serve a new purpose. And different barns are going to have different characteristics, everything from the size of the building to how it's framed, how it's finished, what kind of features that tell you about how it was used, what kind of agricultural purpose it served. That's all part of the equation when you're thinking about how to adapt a barn to new use. I mean, there's some really easy, kind of obvious ones. Barns were often big storage buildings, so maybe it's not hay anymore, but maybe there's some other kind of storage that could happen. That's a really easy, minimal amount of change kind of thing that has to happen. There are plenty of barns that have been adapted to sort of more intensive uses, some kind of industrial purpose, or, the ever-present event barn. And there are lots of really creative ways that people have been able to, repurpose barns so that they're serving a new function, but you still get that character. You can still walk into it and say, hey, this is a barn. And if in 50 or 100 years from now, somebody wanted to start farming again, that building could go back to being a barn.
Yeah, I think, similar to the location, the question of moving barns, it's about, how can we interpret this building, right? That's the value to the community, is when we look at this building, we see that history, that agricultural history of the town and of the region at large. And so some part of us wants to retain that historic integrity of the building, that when we look at it, we can see that it's a barn. We, more of a trained eye might be able to place the barn within a certain time frame and a period of history. Where I think Caitlin and the division and Preservation Trust can really be helpful is, we can kind of come in, and as preservationists, we can say, hey, the parts of this barn that are really important are the size, are the, that big barn door on the front of it, or the fact that it was, a gable front barn or something like that. These are the significant features of the barn. And if you're going to make changes, these are the specific parts of the building that should be retained or preserved. The other parts, while we love to see them retained, we understand that, not everything can be preserved all the time. So I think that's a great resource that's available to all of you.
As folks go out and fall in love with their barns and make decisions about how they want to use them, are there hazardous materials issues to look out for?
I actually fell through a floor in a barn for the first time in all my time spending in barns. It wasn't that bad, but you know, I was kind of shocked after it happened that it was the first time that it had happened. So, you know, for buildings that have maybe had some rot or some moisture or some
Right.
other structural damage, it's definitely something to kind of keep in mind and kind of be cognizant of where you're going and where you're walking. And if you have questions, call somebody that has more
That's
experience.
happened to me too, so I'm right there with you. Watch your
Good. I didn't want to be alone in my embarrassment. You know, and then other things just kind of, you know, hay and animal waste and stuff like that. Definitely something to be aware of. You know, I think a lot of times pigeons can take over barns or raccoons or something like that. So something just to keep in mind. I won't say that it's a, you know, a reason to never enter your building. It's just something to maybe keep in the back of your mind as you're going through.
Okay, let's take this to the next level. We've fallen in love. We've decided that there's no question, whatever we use the barn for, it needs a lot of work. We want to build a relationship with craftspeople and tradesmen who can do the work. But how do we find those contractors?
I'll just quickly make a plug and I'll try to get a link to our Preservation Trust has a restoration directory on our website, which we always kind of have to walk this line. We're not fully endorsing these contractors, but I'd say it's a curated list of people that do restoration work within the state. I think that's a great place to start. Also, reaching out to PTV would be another great place. You know, reach out to a field service representative and we can try to connect you. New Hampshire Preservation Alliance also has incredible field service staff that can also be really useful. And then, you know, I think word of mouth and referrals, going out to neighbors that have had previous work done, or if you see, you know, somebody up on a building that and it looks like they're doing good work, just go talk to them.
Yeah, I would echo that word of mouth. I mean, Vermont's a small state, it's a small community. You know, you're likely to have neighbors who have, you know, had work done on their barn, and, you know, talking to them about who they worked with is always an easy place to start. But as Alex mentioned, you know, the resources that we have at the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation and the Preservation Trust of Vermont, I mean, part of our mission is to help educate and advocate. And so, you know, you can always reach out to us, and we're happy to try to connect you with additional resources. I always have to caveat that because I'm a funder, we don't provide recommendations for contractors. It's just a conflict of interest for us. But you know, we do work very closely, obviously, with lots of very skilled folks, and you know, we're happy to, as I said, to connect you with people who can give you technical assistance, advice, and get you headed in the right direction.
And another thing that I think our organizations could help with is maybe giving you some questions to ask contractors. You know, if you've engaged someone, you know, maybe ask them, hey, what are your thoughts on the Secretary of Interior standards or something like that? It shouldn't rule them out necessarily, but it might kind of give you a little bit of insight into their how they go about restoring a building.
To be sure. Okay, here comes the question that perhaps at least half of our viewers have signed up tonight to learn more about, and I completely understand. And that is, are there grant programs and tax credits to preserve barns?
Kaylin, should I start?
There are, but why don't you start, Alex?
I'll start just because typically the way it works is people will come to the Preservation Trust of Vermont, and usually kind of a good first step is a small matching grant that we offer through our barn grant program, which is just a $250 matching grant to hire a timber framer or a contractor to come out and do an assessment of the barn. It's really just kind of documenting the status quo of the building. So it's not huge, but I think it's a really useful first step and offers kind of a roadmap and priorities of different repairs that will be needed. So typically commonly what happens is people reach out to the Preservation Trust. They will get this small matching grant. We've had to kind of think about who we're offering the grant to just because of limited resources. So it's really being based on whether or not you'd be eligible for future grants. But what happens is people reach out to us, they might get this small matching grant. And then once they have this kind of assessment done, we try to connect them to Caitlin. And that's when Caitlin's programs typically kick in.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. I think we're so fortunate in Vermont that we have this great sort of partnership between Preservation Trust of Vermont and our Division for Historic Preservation. I don't know what it's like in the rest of the country, so maybe it's like this everywhere, but I feel like we're really lucky that we have this great relationship, and we're in constant communication. I'm working with PTV's field service representatives all the time. If people do reach out to me first, I often send them to PTV to kind of get them started. I think the assessment program is so useful. As Alex said, it's a great place to start, just to give you sort of a sense of what am I dealing with, what are the issues that I have to address, and how should I prioritize those? Like, should I do this first or should I do that first? And how much is this going to cost? Is it going to be like $5,000 or $50,000? Just to kind of, so you can kind of wrap your arms around what you're dealing with. And I think it does really set you up very nicely for the state's barn grant program, which is a program that I administer. So the state offers matching 50-50 matching grants of up to $15,000 to do actual repair of historic agricultural buildings. We call it the barn grant program, but that's just because agricultural buildings is much more of a mouthful. We definitely fund projects on other types of agricultural buildings as well. It's really meant to be sort of those fundamental pieces of the building: the roof, the foundation, the timber frame, the structure, things like the siding and doors and windows. The program is really focused on preserving and repairing those elements of the building. We don't fund work to make improvements like, add electrical service or, if it was going to be a public use building, we're not going to be providing grants to do things like add bathrooms or accessibility or anything like that. But it's meant to sort of help you get that building into good enough shape that it can be a functional building again. We fund a lot of projects just on the basic structure, roof projects, and foundation work. Those are sort of the top three of the program. I will also just briefly mention that there is a federal tax credit program, the Rehabilitation Investment Tax Credit Program, that I administer as well for projects here in Vermont. It is a more difficult program to access. It's a federal program. There's more paperwork involved. There's more hoops you sort of have to jump through to qualify. It's meant for large scale projects. Buildings need to be listed in the National Register to qualify. And it is for buildings that have some kind of commercial purpose. So it's not for your personal barn that's just being used for storage or your garage or something like that. It has to have a commercial purpose. But if you tick all of those boxes, I'm more than happy to talk with you about the program and how you would go about meeting the preservation requirements of the tax credit program.
Okay,
I'll
Yeah.
just also kind of
keep going.
briefly, Kayla and I, this kind of the white whale, so to speak, of the other projects is, and I'll put the link in the chat, is a barn painting program through the Department of Agriculture. And they've teamed up with Pizzigali Construction. So it's sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. But I know that they have painted barns in the past. So I'll put a link up there. And if you have any questions, we can try to find out more for you, or you might also have good, better luck reaching out to the DOA yourself.
Terrific. I can hear people taking notes. So that's what we want. Here's maybe a quick one. I don't know. If I were to accept grant money from one of these agencies, am I giving up my rights to do with my property what I want? After all, it's Vermont. But what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely want to know what you're getting into, right? I mean, I will say that for the state grant program, if you accept a barn preservation grant from the state, we will be involved in the project, and we will have to approve the work that's being done on your barn and how it's being done. There's also a 5-year sort of, for lack of a better word, compliance period after you've received a grant, where if you did additional work on the building, you would need to check in with us. And the reason behind that is that this is public funding. You know, it's our taxpayer dollars that are going to this program, and so it's our responsibility to make sure that the funding is going to meet the goals of the program, which is to preserve historic agricultural buildings and their historic character. You know, after that 5-year period, there's no further oversight. We're not in it to, you know, tell you what you can do with your property for the rest of your life, and we would never have the capacity to do it anyway. I think it's important to point out that we view this as being not like an oversight thing as much as being more of a partnership. You know, we want to support you in your efforts to, you know, preserve your barn. We think this program wouldn't work. It wouldn't be successful if we didn't have people that were willing to invest their own money in fixing up their barns, and we really appreciate that people are willing to make those investments in Vermont's historic agricultural buildings. So it's never meant to be something where we come in and tell you, you can do this, you can't do that. You know, it's meant to be more of a conversation, a partnership, where we're all working towards the goal of preserving this important historic resource.
Yeah. Let me ask this, which is, do preservation easements make sense in barn preservation?
Sorry, Kayla.
Go for it, Alex. I'll jump in.
You know, the Preservation Trust owns several easements on not necessarily just barns, but on different properties around the state. I think easements make sense if you want to ensure that the building is cared for and well maintained in perpetuity. But in perpetuity, you know, forever is a very long time. So,
Long time.
and it's definitely a commitment. It's not something to enter into lightly. But it's something, it's a serious commitment to preservation. That said, I think the best part about the preservation easement is that it kind of links you to preservation experts in perpetuity, right? And that, every year or whatever the easement kind of states, when that easement coordinator comes by and takes a look at the building, you're getting an expert opinion on how to care for your building annually. They're keeping you on your toes with deferred maintenance and offering best practices. So I think if that's something that you think you would benefit from, and I think it's definitely a conversation to have with your family, but I think they do make sense in the right scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said there, Alex. I think the first thing is to really think carefully about what your goal is. A preservation easement is the most powerful tool we sort of have in our toolbox to ensure preservation of historic resources. A lot of times people think that being listed in the National Register of Historic Places will save your building from future demolition or alteration, and that's actually not true. It's a common misconception that people have, that somehow that designation protects the building. It doesn't. It's largely an honorific thing to be listed in the National Register. So if your goal is to make sure that a resource is preserved in perpetuity, an easement is the most powerful tool that we have. But as Alex said, it shouldn't be entered into lightly. There are ramifications that you probably can't even think of. In perpetuity is a long time. So it's always something that I know we're happy to talk with people about, help them understand their options. And obviously Preservation Trust, as the holder of many easements, is a great resource as well to sort of talk through what it means and how it might be put in place. One of the nice things about an easement is that it's really tailored to a particular property and the goals of that property owner. They can be very restrictive, or they can be mostly just about the building has to be maintained. And it could be just the exterior. It could include interior features. It could include landscape features. It's really however you want to do it to meet your goals.
Well said, both of you. Here's another one, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor, assuming you're all still out there. And that is, goes like this. This is all about practicality at the end of the day. Money aside, are all barns worth saving?
Well, you're asking somebody who's a historic preservationist, so my answer is probably predictable, I guess. But I would say, I come from this as a historic preservationist. I care deeply about our history and our built environment, and what that tells us about our past, what it tells us about our future. What it tells us about our community, how it creates community and continues community. But I also, being a Vermonter, I like to think about being green and the environment. And I think that in that sense as well, preservation of existing buildings is a really important thing that we should be thinking about. As long as a building is standing and fixable, it can serve a purpose. And why would you tear it down when it still could serve a function? You're just throwing away all of that material. You're throwing away all of the energy that went into creating that building. And chances are, there's new construction happening all the time. Some of those new buildings, some of those functions could be in an existing building. And let's recycle, let's reuse.
Yeah.
be green in
Yeah,
that way.
you're also throwing away past knowledge about how to do things, and you're throwing away often, even though they're old, quality materials that are very difficult to find now. So
Absolutely.
couldn't
I just want
agree
to
more.
add, I think we're the stewards of these buildings, right? And that when you buy the property or you take on that responsibility, you're accepting that you are the current steward of what has been around for decades and decades, if not well over a century or two. So, I think you have to understand your own place in that building's history and understand that, well, you might not have use for it, the next owner might. And when you tear that building down, you remove that possibility, you remove that you put a giant stop in that building's history. And you say, no one will ever be able to use this ever again.
Yeah.
And then that's not saying that you have to pour all of your money into saving it, but I think it's definitely something to consider when thinking about the building. And so many times when people get those small assessment grants from us and they get a price tag on all the repairs, it's overwhelming. And the next thing that they have to say is, well, that's not possible, so I might as well just walk away. But no, I think it's so often we have to think about, okay, well, what are the kind of stabilization things that we can do to keep this building alive, if not just for the next few years, but for the decades to come. And these are, as I think we said at the beginning, these are resilient buildings. Kaylin and I have seen hundreds of barns that have probably not been cared for 30, 40 years that are in remarkably good shape. So before you even consider demolition, I think it's important to get us, a condition report of what the building is. How likely is it to just fall to the ground? Probably not very likely. What are some small steps that you can take to preserve the building and save it for future generations?
Yeah, and when you do that, you're also often saving a landmark in each community. And that's what I started off with, that these buildings, they're large, they're impressive, they still have a functional application, but they're also part of who we are and how our communities are defined. So there's a cultural aspect there too, that along with these other, some might say more practical considerations, are of cultural importance as well. So with that, and looking at the clock here, let's open it up to any questions that our audience might have. And Sarah can help with this. There she is.
Yes, I think you can put questions in the chat, or I think you could also just raise your hand, which you can find at the bottom of the screen, and we can call on you and you can unmute and ask your question that way if you prefer. And thank you all so much for providing such a good overview. And it's not as overwhelming to know, to have a barn knowing that there's help out there for sure. So thank you for that. And man, it's looking like maybe you've answered all the questions there were. It was so
Amazing.
thorough. I'm not seeing questions coming
Yeah,
up.
any takers out there?
I
Anybody
will
want to
say-
refute anything we said?
Oh, here we go. How do we know if our barn has ever been moved? What are some clues to look for?
That's a really good question. Yeah. I think Lisa Papazian actually covered this a little bit in her talk 2 weeks ago. A lot of times barns were moved to early barns, like early English barns, were moved to be kind of put onto a hillside to add another sort of level below and make them into a bank barn. And you can tell that by looking at how the construction of main barn is as compared with the framing below. There's often a distinctive change between that, which is kind of a telltale signal that that the barn got moved to a bank. And the other thing that you can always look for as well, particularly if you have what looks like barns that got kind of connected and moved together, it's often really easy to tell with timber frame in the joinery, where you've got, you know, empty pockets where it looks like it got cut out for something, but there's nothing there anymore. That's an indication that either the timbers were salvaged from some other building and used to construct a new barn, or things got moved. And so when they reconnected, maybe connected multiple barns, the framing had to be adjusted to make that happen.
I think
Are
also
there other thoughts, Alex, on that?
yeah, the location, you know, I think location of the barn is another can be another clue. You know, sometimes barns, I think earlier barns were put a little bit farther away from the house, and then you know, as time went on and the science of, you know, the farmyard was developed, and we see that kind of like tight grouping of all these barns, that can be another clue that it was moved. Sometimes the original barn was just built close to the house, but not always.
Thanks for that question.
Yeah.
Any others out there? I'm guessing that most of the people on this call have barns, they wouldn't be here. So you may be getting some calls from Norwich. It's looking like maybe we don't have a lot of questions.
Yeah, maybe we're there.
Oh, wait. No, we do have one over here. If you could unmute, Ms. J. Porter, you can ask your question.
Hey, John Porter, I just want to say hi to Phil Zay. I don't know if you remember the name, but
Oh, I
my
do.
dad Clifton and your dad are good friends, and our family grew up in your neighborhood.
That's exactly right. And we know that you've written on barns and know a lot about them. And this is a place where, you know, the Connecticut River may make two states out of what's basically one frame of mind, so to speak. So New Hampshire and Vermont have a huge heritage in agriculture, but also in agricultural buildings. One of my favorite barns isn't a Vermont barn, although I've got those too, but I always think of the fabulous barn, Shaker Barn in Enfield, New Hampshire.
Right.
That's just a phenomenal building. So it's fun to drive around and look at these barns and in their landscape and benefit from everything that they tell us.
We do have another question here from Lori. What's your opinion about a metal roof?
I'll take this one. You know, I think a lot of historic barns have metal roofs now. They probably didn't originally, but you know, it was kind of a cost-effective way of putting on a pretty sustainable roof. I'd say now, you know, I think Kayla may disagree with me. I think if the barn has, you know, cedar shingle on it now, or cedar shake on it now, sometimes we like to see it. But, you know, for me, a metal roof is really, it's probably the longest lasting and most durable roofing material. And from a maintenance perspective, I think it's an excellent choice. Not every barn is the same, and maybe if your barn's really intact and, you know, historically intact, and you're trying to preserve it as it always has been, then maybe a metal roof wouldn't be the best choice. But I think for longevity, I think metal roof is a great choice. Either corrugated or standing
I'm
steel.
happy to chime in. You know, it's so hard to answer that question because I think it kind of does depends on the barn in question. You know, if you were going to apply for a grant, what I would tell you is, you know, if you've got a beautiful slate roof, we'd love to see you preserve that.
Yeah.
Or, you know, replace it in kind as opposed to changing your roofing material to metal. But, you know, on the other side of that, if it's got asphalt shingles on it now and you want to find something that's maybe longer lasting, a metal roof could be an appropriate and really good choice, really practical choice. You know, very practically speaking, wood shingle roofs are not going to last very long. The materials available today are just not what they once were in terms of wood products out there. And so unless you're talking about something that's, as Alex mentioned, really maybe high style, very intact, or if you're in a museum setting, you know, those are places where you'd really want to try and maybe preserve the look of the wood shingle roof. But a very large percentage of barns, I think metal roofing is a solid choice. The one thing I would say is I would stay away from those like colored standing seam metal roofs that have become so popular on the new construction. You want to stick with something that's just more like a galvalume or something like that, that's more in keeping with, you know, what you see on old agricultural buildings. It's still really long lasting, really, and would be less expensive.
Well, we all like that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone, and particularly my colleagues here at the upper right of my screen, and of course, Sarah and all that she does for the commission. So it's been a great two-part series, and all in a good cause that we all need to focus on and try to keep the built environment as it relates to the Vermont landscape healthy and moving forward. So with that, good night.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank
Thank
you.